Hey guys, welcome back. I wanted to update the pledged delegate tracker to see where we're at right now with this 2020 Democratic primary race. And starting off with Joe Biden, perhaps the biggest disappointment out of all the candidates for the New Hampshire primary, where he comes in a considerable distant fifth place, getting just 8.4% of the vote in New Hampshire. So he's picking up 0 pledged delegates in this instance. Now, Bernie Sanders was able to win the popular vote for the second state in a row, but it wasn't quite enough to get him to separate with Pete Buttigieg, where they both get the same amount of pledged delegates from what is a very small state that doesn't have a lot of pledged delegates up for grabs. Bernie brings in 9. So that gets him up to 21, and he's officially over 1% of the way to the 1,990 pledged delegates that he'll need to win on the first ballot at the convention. Then Michael Bloomberg still not figuring to be a factor in these first 4 states, where he's going to ramp up and probably start getting something in the way of pledged delegates as we head into the month of March and into Super Tuesday. Elizabeth Warren, also, there can be an argument here that she was the biggest disappointment in New Hampshire, not Joe Biden, given the fact that she is the senator from the neighboring state of Massachusetts, and if you're putting together a scenario where Elizabeth Warren is having enough strength to go on and win the Democratic nomination by the time we reach the convention, then you'd probably figure that she'd be doing pretty well in a state like New Hampshire. Then Pete Buttigieg, he's also able to grab 9, a really solid finish for him. He was able to build off of the momentum that he was able to pick up from a pretty respectable result in Iowa, bringing that over into New Hampshire, 2 states that he's spent a lot of time, effort, and resources into having success with. Now going forward is where things start to get a lot tougher for Pete. He doesn't have the same organization and ground game in these states like Nevada and South Carolina, in contrast to what he had in Iowa and New Hampshire. And then, of course, going to Super Tuesday, going to be even more difficult beyond that. And not just simply because of the ground game in the campaign that Pete has. He should get a boost in some instances because he's been able to vault himself more so into that national picture, but his relative weakness among minority voters, where that's going to become more of a factor here in the upcoming contest. We'll see how much that negatively affects his results going through those areas. So he's able to pick up 9, and that gets him up to 22 pledged delegates officially, with just a slight lead over Bernie Sanders. We're still waiting on that 1 pledged delegate left in Iowa based on who wins the most state delegate equivalents on the statewide level. That one will either be awarded to Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg at the end of the day. But then Tom Steyer also bringing in 0. Now Steyer, he's put more effort and resources into having success in Nevada and South Carolina. So not a huge factor in Iowa and New Hampshire, but perhaps he can surprise in the next 2 results. And then Amy Klobuchar, perhaps the biggest surprise of the night. I'd say that that's actually a pretty safe bet, where the expectations for Klobuchar were probably somewhere in the 5th, 4th place range, but then she gets a really strong 3rd place, significantly past where Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden are sitting, almost able to grab 20% of the vote. She's able to pick up 6 pledged delegates in this instance. So that gets her up to 7 in total. So right now, the picture that we're looking at is Joe Biden, extremely disappointing out of the gate, only grabbing 6 pledged delegates, and then you have a competitive race at the top between Sanders and Buttigieg in the type of demographics, very white-leaning voter states in Iowa and New Hampshire. Now that we start heading to more diverse states, we'll see how that dynamic plays out, but one would assume that it would be more beneficial to Sanders. And then also just taking a look at this from a larger national picture, we're still in a situation where Bernie Sanders is the frontrunner, not just because of winning the popular vote in the first 2 states, but also he's surpassed Joe Biden in the average of the national polls. This is the first time this has happened throughout this entire past year. So Sanders is taking that progressive lane, occupying that particular wing of the party, and is able to coalesce a lot of that vote behind him. But the centrists and moderates are still trying to figure out who they're going to end up running on the top line against Bernie Sanders, because if we still take a look at the average of the national polls, which is something in the way of an important indicator on who can have success across all 50 states, you still have Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren polling higher than Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, who are getting the positive momentum and press coming out of New Hampshire. So that can change a bit going forward. This is a very fluid and dynamic situation, very muddled in what we're seeing behind Bernie Sanders as the front runner, not a clear option for the centrists to coalesce behind, to give it their best effort to try to get their candidate past the finish line, we'll see how this all ends up playing out. But I actually still think there's a very strong case to be made that by the time we get through the rest of this month and in through a very key month being March in terms of the number of pledged delegates that are up for grabs, it could very well be a Bernie Sanders versus Michael Bloomberg head-to-head race, just because Bloomberg has the funding and the resources to maybe be the de facto centrist hope in this instance, because the other candidates like Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Biden, their support hasn't been able to solidify among one individual, and it's just becoming a very muddled situation. And who knows what the future is going to hold for these national polls, but if Buttigieg and Klobuchar don't start doing significantly better among the minority voting communities, then they're going to continue to hover in that upper single digits, lower double digits range, and that's just not going to be enough to seriously contend for the nomination. So we'll have to see how that dynamic continues to play out, if they're able to peel over some of that support that's been leaching away from Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren to really reshape how this race still currently stands, where you have Bernie being the front runner, and then really anyone's guess after that point. So this is the update in terms of the pledged delegates. And then in my next video, going to recap the predictions that I had made for New Hampshire, see where I went right and where I went wrong. So I appreciate you guys stopping by. Consider subscribing for more, and hope to see you back here for my next video.